It's my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. I met Daryl Smith about 7 years ago when I was still a student at Asbury Seminary. I was almost 50 when I finished, so in many ways I had more in common with my professors than with my classmates. But Daryl at that time was the head of the leadership department. Well, he still is. And I had 2 classes with him in my last year at Asbury. And I found Daryl to be a wise and generous mentor in that season. After I finished seminary, Daryl started a book project. Some of you are familiar with this book, Radical Journey. Some of our small groups have used this as your curriculum. Gina and I had the privilege of participating in this project, and Daryl was the captain of our team. By the time we finished, the team had dwindled so that some of our book project meetings were essentially just double dates with Daryl and Carol and Smith and Kurt and Gina. But that was good, and we enjoyed our time with them, and they were good friends to us. In fact, over the last couple of years, everybody knows Gina and I have been through a couple of valleys, and Daryl and Carolyn have been loyal and faithful friends to us during that time. Daryl's had an impact on this church that's somewhat subtle but plain to see. Many of you have heard me say that small groups are the lifeblood of our church, not just a ministry of our church. Well, that's a quote from Daryl Smith. I learned that when I was a student in his class. And today, we spend a lot of energy and effort on our small groups, and we have several that are thriving. And so a large part of that is because of his influence. We're honored to have him as our speaker at Melbourne Community Church today.
I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say after that. That's a bit embarrassing. Boy, what a delight to be back here, though. We have not been in this building before because Carolyn and I, in fact, my wife Carolyn is with me this morning. The double dates are really good times. We found a little, it's not a pizza shop, what's it called? Americana Pub in Cocoa Village. It's kind of halfway between, so that's been a good place we found to write and to meet and gather periodically. Not very often, actually, but as often as we can. But I think the last time we were with you, because of our ministry obligations on weekends, as I say, isn't very often that we've been able to be here, but was in the other buildings. So it's great to see the new facility here. And as Kurt said, we're just privileged to be colleagues with Kurt and Gina. You know how special people they are. And to be able to walk with them through some of the tough days they've been through in the last couple of years, as you know, and they're still going through. And we continue to pray for that. And for Kurt's continued healing. Great news so far. That's a great word. But you've been working through the book of Acts for quite a while, so I said, Kurt, let me not disrupt things. Let me see if I can sort of jump in midstream with you and paddle in the same direction. So that's really what I'm going to try to do with you today. And as we've been walking through the book of Acts, we've been watching the church blossom from the day of Pentecost, and actually from Jesus' ascension into heaven through the day of Pentecost, and watching the various disciples as they move out into ministry around the world, and living out the life as Jesus followers, and what that meant in the new first century, and what that meant for the church. In the last several weeks, you may remember that you've been looking, and we've been looking at Paul. This is pretty morbid in a sense, because Paul traveled to the churches he'd planted, that he'd started, and is saying goodbye. It's his last goodbye as he walks toward or heads toward Jerusalem. And as I think Kurt mentioned to you last week, it's sort of a symbol of Jesus' walk to Jerusalem in the same way. As he moved toward Jerusalem, knowing that good things were not planned for him there. And last week, Paul ended up in chains as he arrived in Jerusalem, or not quite at the very moment, but he ended up in chains because of what? A false rumor was spread by some people who'd come to town, and they passed this false rumor around saying that Paul had walked a non-Jew through the temple. Sounds a little bit like my Facebook. Rumors get going when people hear something or read something, and then hundreds of angry people are posting things, and even when they're proved wrong, they say, nah, I don't want to believe that. They just keep going. Reminds me a little bit of that Jewish community. And you remember as Paul was coming to Jerusalem, many leaders warned him not to go there. They said, it's not safe for you to go back there. And he said, no, I'm going. I'll be okay. And even when he arrived, what did they do? They said, to prove you're really a Jew, a really healthy, well-rounded Jew, let's put you and 4 other guys through a purification process. So they start through that purification process, and just as the ceremony is about to end, they're down to the last few days, this is when the angry mob arrives, and because of this rumor, they capture him in the temple and drag him outside, lock it up so he can't get back in for safety. How's that for trying to please the crowd? Today, we'll hope to pick out several key points. These are things I saw, and I hope that you'll pick up some other points along the way as we walk through Paul's response to the crowd and the crowd's reaction to him. I think at least here are a few key points that I'm seeing anyway. God can powerfully use our Jesus story. God can powerfully use our Jesus story. Also, that when we use that we can use the gifts God has given us for the sake of God's kingdom, and it opens doors to share God's love. And we'll talk about that in some length. Also, God wants to actively heal those attitudes, those values, those prejudices, those things that, well, honestly, make us not look a whole lot like Jesus. God wants to heal those. And then the fourth point that I see is that we can miss God's mission when we make life all about us. When we make life center around us, the sun revolves around us, and we exclude other people, and we make the circle smaller and smaller of who we include and who we exclude. God's mission through us is to bless the world. That's what we're called to. In fact, let's take just a moment, and we don't have time to walk through all of this, but let's go back to the Old Testament passage that was read at the beginning of worship and just take a quick look at it because it sets up this whole scenario that we are into today. Some of you remember the story of Abram, and his name at that point was Abram, because he follows God. It's before his name was changed. He follows God from what's now near Mesopotamia across into what is now the nation of Israel. So here he's not sure where he's going, but God calls him, and it takes a while for him to get there. But he ends up over there, and God calls him and says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And that's an agreement where God, and at that point his name was changed to Abraham, where God and Abraham make a covenant, and his future generations are to bless the world if he and his offspring obey God's direction. And then the last couple of verses there that were read for us this morning come at the end of that strange story. Some of you remember it, where Abraham was commanded by God to take his son Isaac up on the mountain and sacrifice him. And this is a culture, and we don't have time to look at all the cultural context, but that was child sacrifice was not unusual in their culture. But God had promised this son, Isaac, would be the one who would be the seed of nations across the world, and thousands, as many people as the sands of the seashore, and as many stars as in the sky. And Abraham's going, wait a minute, how can that be? But he says, okay, I'll trust God. And as the verses were read at the end, an angel appears and says, wait, stop. God just is checking you out to see if you're really willing to follow me all the way. So Abraham, at that point, sets the standard for future generations. And that brings us to the Jewish response at the end of Paul's witness on the Beric steps, is where we pick him up this morning. But before we jump into this amazing passage, we do remember, and I think you know, that the Jewish people, as I said, were trying to kill Paul because of this false rumor that had been spread. But I want us not to just look at the Jews. The Jews get a bad rap. They did some really bad things here. But I want to put a little bit of a parenthesis for us. Let's not just leave it in that century, the first century. Let's not make it so much about the Jews, because that was their context. They were living in that world, trying to make sense of life. But if the Bible's going to be relevant to us, we must bring it into our context, into our generation, and apply it to those contexts. So let's put ourselves into the picture. So every time we mention Jews, let's put our name in that line. And let's see what God might teach us about what it is to be Jesus followers today. And you remember the Roman commander came to the rescue. He actually had to carry Paul. I sort of see him like a mosh pit, yeah. You know, he didn't actually fall into it off the stage, but they had to sort of carry him to keep him from getting wiped out by the people. And they take him off to this barracks, which is where the story starts for us today. I'm not sure I would have wanted to go to a barracks, Roman barracks, as a Jew, but he didn't have much choice. So it's as good as it gets, I guess, in his culture and in his setting. So we start with Acts 21:37. As the soldiers, and this was read for us, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you?" That's a strange question. Paul just talked to him in Greek. "No, I don't speak." If it had been me, if my life was at stake, I probably wouldn't have said it, but I'd be a bit snarky and say, "No, that's just some language I made up and you happen to understand it." But he says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Here we are. Another rumor has been started. Where did the Roman commander even come up with that idea? But he's acting toward Paul as if that is true. Paul answered, "No, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were silent, he said to them in Aramaic, catch that? Change language on them. Aramaic. "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." Take a moment and smell the air. What do you smell? You're standing on the steps with Paul. Or maybe you're standing in the crowd. Hundreds, maybe thousands of people gathered. They're angry. Paul has trodden in places he probably shouldn't have trodden, at least according to them. There's dust. First thing came to my mind as I think about what it smells like, I think of sweat. No air conditioning. Hurricane just came through and it's been 3 days without air conditioning. How do you feel? Yuck. Paul seems to be the only person around who has composure in this setting. And so he pauses and then says, "Brothers and fathers, listen to my defense." We've talked about it before because Paul has the ability to somehow, maybe it's a gift God has given him, to connect to people wherever he is, to the people of the culture that he's working with and talking to. And we've seen many examples. Again, he speaks Greek to the Roman because why would he speak Greek to him? Greek was the language, the common language of the Roman Empire. The whole New Testament's written in Greek. But when he's going to talk to the Jews, he talks to them in their language. And the commander, I notice also, you notice Paul's response here to the commander when he's accused of being this terrorist who's gone off into Egypt. The commander lives in a world of status and pomp and circumstance. They parade around on their horses and in their armor. And so Paul uses his Jewish heritage, he uses his cultural status to confront and actually to open the door for him to speak with the commander. Notice that he talks about, "I'm a Jew. I'm from Tarsus of Cilicia." That's just not an ordinary city. I'm pretty cool. But it's not about him. He's using what he has as his personhood and the gifts that he has to open doors for the kingdom message. So he's really not flaunting his status, which I think so many times we often get into. It's sort of, I was trying to think of a scenario of that, even in sports. The awards, the medallions, the trophies, and Paul's saying, "Okay, I've got the trophies, let me lay them out here." But he doesn't use it to flaunt his own ego. Instead, he's opening this door, as I said, for God's work. Even when facing potential death, Paul looks for an opportunity to share his story of walking with Jesus. One of the things that also caught me in these first few verses is why Paul said brothers and fathers. That's interesting. Who was in this crowd, I wonder? I was wondering why he didn't say hi, y'all, in some good Southern Jewish accent. But I think, could it be because it was a patriarchal culture? That could be. So he's talking to the men. The men were the only ones present? Probably not. I assume that there were lots of women in the crowd. The women weren't allowed to give a calming voice because they weren't allowed to speak in that culture. They were only property. And so they were just basically told what to do. So they were probably not included because of that. But maybe he knew where the power stood. And Paul was never afraid to speak into the controllers of power with truth. The controllers of power in the Jewish culture were the fathers and the brothers. Again, he steps into the Jewish, his people's cultural context changing to the language of Aramaic. And that's really why Carolyn and I are trying, I shouldn't even claim it myself, because Carolyn's the one who's doing so well at it, studying Spanish. We've decided that it's really important to be better communicators in Central Florida where we work and where we minister. So we're studying Spanish. It's important to communicate with people in their first language. And my colleagues who are Spanish speakers as their first language keep reminding me that Spanish is the language of heaven, so I'm trying to get ready. Regularly they remind me of that. But let's move on to Acts 2:22 here. We've just jumped into the first part of, we've finished the 21 and jumping into 22, verses 2 to 5. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. It's almost like you could hear a pin drop. And here's maybe 1,000, 2,000 sweaty, dirty, dusty, angry people, and it's so quiet you can hear a pin drop. Pretty amazing stuff. Do you hear it? Then Paul lays out his pedigree to the Jews. He's already done this to the Roman. Now he lays it out to the Jews. Then Paul said, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in where? This city. So I know Jerusalem. I'm not stupid about this. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. Gamaliel, if you remember him later in the New Testament, is the one who is one of the primary old-timers in the Pharisees and is the person that people listen to, one of the great teachers. I was just as zealous for God as any of you today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. Again, his pedigree is, you think I'm not Jewish enough? First of all, I was in the middle of this ceremony when you captured me. And then, first, I was born a Jew, just like you. I was born in an important city. You weren't. Well, maybe you were because you were in Jerusalem. But I was born in an important city. I was raised in Jerusalem. That's a big deal when you're a Jew. I studied under one of the most famous Jewish teachers, Gamaliel. I know the Mosaic Law. You don't have to tell me. I know it. I was zealous just like you are today. Isn't that amazing? Here's the people trying to kill him, and he's complimenting him. I was zealous for God just like you. How's that for a compliment when they're trying to, well, I was going to say stab you in the back. It was more than that. They wanted to string him up. In fact, he says, I was on the inside with the religious leaders. I was doing the very same thing you're trying to do to me. I was trying to kill people for the way, who were part of the way, I should say, Jesus' way. Paul knew the Jews would be impressed with his pedigree since they knew how their leaders paraded around. Remember Jesus in the New Testament, in the Gospels, how many times does he talk about the Pharisees standing and praying on the corners to be seen? Or they fast and make sure everybody notices. These people knew what pedigrees were like. They knew what it was to live in pomp and circumstance. So Paul takes that emphasis upon status and turns it back as verifying his ability to be let me say it that way, is verifying his position to speak to them and that they should pay attention. That's probably the better way to say that. Now to the heart of this story. This is Paul's Jesus story. It picks up in verse 6. About noon as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? I asked. I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you were persecuting, he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do. My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment, I was able to see him. Remember, this is coming back from Luke's account in Acts 9. Paul's repeating the story again and bringing us up to date on it. And what he's saying is, this is my story. And this isn't the last time he's going to share his story. He shares his story 2 or 3 more times to various people we'll find as he moves on toward Rome. But he doesn't go in, notice he doesn't go into some theological discourse. He doesn't teach a seminary class. Paul is telling his story because story connects. Our stories, our Jesus stories connect to other people. Why is drama so important? Why are movies? We get caught up in movie stories. Stories are how we live. Our whole world is filled with God's story going on from before eternity forever to the end, beyond the end of time. And then you have your story. I have my story. And Jesus says when those 3 stories get connected, amazing things happen. Actually, Jesus said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I show up. But it's the idea that you have your story. That's why we're called to live in community. Because our stories, with all the differences in them, make a great tapestry together to show God's love as we tap into God's story, which is going on forever. So Paul grabbed the story. He said, this is my story. In essence, he's saying, you may not like what you hear me say, but you can't refute what happened to me because it's my story. And when we're talking with other people about what God has done in our lives, it's our story. It has validity because we've lived it. And he's saying, let me tell you, just listen a minute. Let me tell you how Jesus changed me. I was doing what you were doing, trying to kill people who were following Jesus, but now I'm different because I got knocked off my horse. He really didn't have a choice, did he? He's a follower of Jesus because Jesus goes whack and said, follow me. Pick up in verse 14. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will, and this is God speaking, or Jesus speaking to him in saying, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people for what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. Chosen by God for God's mission. You can't resist the mission when you're knocked off your horse. So Paul didn't really have much choice. He didn't really have the opportunity to say, sorry, God, I don't feel quite like doing it right now. You remember somebody in the Old Testament did that, got swallowed by a big fish after doing that, didn't he? Said, God, I don't think I want to pull that off at this moment. But Paul did respond positively, and though probably none of us will be like Paul, where we will be knocked off of our horse or pulled out of our car and thrown into the street, we're each called for mission and for ministry. We're called to live out God's mission. And it's really important, and as I say that, let me add one other comment to that. It's important to remember that our lives are not living out our mission. Our lives are living out God's mission. We have the opportunity to join God's mission that God's already doing in the world. When I'm talking to my neighbor and blessing my neighbor and serving my neighbor, I'm not taking God to that neighbor. God's already at work there. I just have the opportunity of joining in what God's already doing. And I become the hands and feet of God's presence, serving my neighbor, serving my cashier, serving the waiter in the restaurant. Because I'm called to live into that mission. Alan Hirsch, a church leader, says it this way: the church doesn't have a mission. God's mission has a church. Let me say that again. The church doesn't have a mission. God's mission has a church. God's mission is already going on in the world. God's always been at work in the world. But he calls us to be a part of that mission. That's all of us. Not just the pastoral staff team, not just the leaders up front or the worship band. And just like Paul, our everyday lives are to be on mission for God. Let me ask a couple questions and get fairly personal here. Where do you live your life tomorrow? At work? Think about that. Where will you be tomorrow? Or maybe Tuesday or Wednesday? It seems like, at least if you grew up like me, are you all familiar with the word missionaries? You've heard the word missionaries. Who are missionaries generally? You can go ahead and speak back to me. Who are missionaries? Okay, they go to a foreign country, and don't they have to cross water? Missionaries, when I was growing up, they were those cool people who crossed water and did God's work. There's enough water in Florida for all of us to cross water tomorrow. Actually, this afternoon. So we're all missionaries. And I think that's what God is telling us through Paul's story, is that I am planted, you are planted, where God wants us to do our mission work tomorrow. If I'm working in an office, if I'm in the school, if I'm catering tables, I'm on mission just like somebody we send to some country around the world. Because God has called each of us. And that's what a privilege, because we're called to bless the world. The message to the Jewish people was not just for Abraham and his descendants, because God says, you're now his descendants. That's what ticked off the Jewish people. Let's go on. Verse 17, when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, the Lord said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Of course, Paul knows better. God wouldn't know. God says, leave, and he says, no, it's okay. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you away to the Gentiles. Whoa! The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of this man. He's not fit to live. Wow. He just got to the word Gentile and they went ballistic. They go ballistic. The word Gentile, the word to describe all of us who are not Jewish in this room, people like you and me, all of us, the idea that God would care for non-Jews was like a swear word. He said Gentiles and they went nuts. They couldn't fathom. They were okay with the murder of Stephen. That was all right. Murder Stephen. Go out and capture men, women, and children and throw them into jail and eventually kill them because they're following Jesus. That's okay. But Paul had touched a really sensitive nerve. He reminded them that they'd lost their way from God's covenant plan with Abraham was to bless the world. Dare I call it, I made this up, dare we call it Jewish exceptionalism? What is exceptionalism? It's the idea that we're the only ones who matter. It's the idea that we're God's favorite. Everyone else is secondary. It's the idea that if you become like us, you smell like us, you taste like us, you look like us, then you can belong to us. And God says, you all belong. I'll help make you what you need to be. But we tend to draw the circle smaller and smaller. And that's where the Jewish people had come. To mention the fact that God might work in other people's lives than just Jews, they could not fathom. As I said, it's like Paul swearing to them. They were good at keeping the rules and traditions. They were really good at that because, remember, Jesus got in trouble all the time. When did he do most of his, we shouldn't say most of his healing. When did he do a lot of his healing? On the Sabbath. He did that on purpose, I think. He just wanted to drive them nuts. He just walked into a temple and said, hey, anybody need healing? It's the Sabbath. I think I'll do it today. I don't think he actually did that, but I think he did it on purpose lots of times. Because the Jews were so bent out of shape of keeping the rules and the regulations, keeping the traditions, but they kept the gates closed on anybody who was different than themselves. How had they gotten so far away from God's dream for them through Abraham's covenant that they missed God's missional call for them to bless the nations? How had they gotten there? I don't know. Probably a lot of reasons, but let me just offer a few possibilities. I think they'd experienced too many years of special privilege. They'd had generations of God doing everything for them. If you wander through the Old Testament, God blesses them, and what do? They walk away. He blesses them, and they walk away. He blesses them. They walk away. That's the whole pattern of the nation. They were never willing to stay true. They'd been blessed so many times. They'd had so many special privileges. They'd sort of forgotten that they were called for mission. Maybe it was that they feared other people who were not like them. I mean, sometimes we do that. We are afraid of people we don't know. They certainly were not intentionally engaging with other people who were of those others out there. They certainly weren't intentionally on mission. They didn't understand that. I think they may have been misunderstanding God. I think what happens is maybe and I find this in my own life, I have to be careful that I don't make God into my own image. God gets pretty small if he's in my image. Because then I start worshiping a God who looks a whole lot like me. And I wonder if they had misunderstood God and that their God was an exclusive God who was just like them. And so they could live that way. Certainly tradition had replaced their faith. And their leaders, Jesus took that on regularly, that tradition had replaced their true faith in God, their true worship. They forgot God's original covenant direction to Abraham. And the big part of that covenant direction is being obedient to the covenant between God and Abraham of making sure that everyone's included. The kingdom's for everyone. They'd forgotten. Maybe on the other side of the coin, we ought to look at what might it have looked like if they were blessing the nations. What are some ways they might have blessed the nations? Jesus gives us plenty of examples because he confronts this before Paul ever was standing on the barracks steps trying to save his own skin and talk to them about his own story and how Jesus made a difference in him. Jesus laid it out for the Jewish people and lays it out for us as well. What might it look like to bless the nations? Blessing the nations at least meant intentionally engaging outcast people. Remember Jesus and the Samaritan woman? Jews would walk. I should have had you do a map for this. You've probably already had it up here, but Jews would walk from Jerusalem over the river up in way out of the way, and I can't remember what the name of the province was, back into Galilee at the north rather than walk straight through Samaria, which was the shortcut. They were not going to hang out with those Samaritan people. So what does Jesus do? Walks right through. Maybe he was in a hurry. It doesn't matter. He says, I don't care. I'm going here. And then he sits down and talks with a Samaritan woman. Men don't talk with women, let alone a Samaritan woman. And the whole town's converted. But he was intentionally inclusive, intentionally engaging the outcast people. Certainly, living as servants to all people would be a good start if we're going to bless the nations. Jesus sat with his disciples at the Last Supper. They'd forgotten to get a servant. Somebody should have washed their feet. They're running around all day in their sandals. Their feet are filthy. And Jesus says, it's starting to stink in here. We need some foot washing. Get the servant. No, that's not what he said, is it? What did Jesus do? Got up from the table, took off his clothes, got the bucket, threw some water in it, and says, here, I'll teach you how you lead in the kingdom. This is what the kingdom leadership looks like. You're on your knees. You're serving. That'd be a great posture for our neighbors. I do that with my students. I did that yesterday. I've been in class for the last two days, so I've been teaching for 16 hours. That's part of why my throat's gone. But sending them on assignments, and I find that so many of my students our pastors do their ministry in their office. They expect people to come in their office, inside the church walls, and they'll do ministry to them. I said, who do you not know that's your neighbor? What if you went and served your neighbor? One of my students a year ago now, in a similar class, told me that he had taken my challenge to go meet his neighbors that he didn't know, and he went down the street about 3 doors to who he knew was a single mom and said, hi, we're in the neighborhood, we've not met before, it's so good to, I want to get some time to meet you and meet your kids. So she introduced herself. He says, we just want you to know that if we can do anything, we're here to help. And she says, where were you 3 years ago when my husband was dying? Missed the opportunity to be in ministry just to serve a family. He's more concerned about his neighbors now. She really embarrassed him, made him feel terrible. He says, he apologized and said, I am so sorry. But serving doesn't have to be at a Last Supper on your knees with a bucket of water with Jesus. It can be wherever we are. Making lives better for the people around us because we've been with them. Everywhere that Jesus went, lives were changed and people were healed. So maybe blessing the nations means that just wherever we go, people are better. The grumpy cashier at Publix. Maybe just a kind word for the grumpy cashier would make a difference in that person's day. And I always ask those embarrassing questions. What are you going to be doing tonight? I never want to answer that question. It's none of your business. But I do want to be a responsible person back and a person who helps make their day better. It also means standing with those who are marginalized. What amazes me about Jesus, particularly when he worked with lepers, is he touched the lepers. Nobody touches lepers. The dignity he gave those lepers by the touch of his skin on them was huge. That probably did more healing than anything else. But he stood with those who were marginalized. In fact, probably one of the most famous examples we see is where in Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about when he returns to earth. And let me just read this for you. I think it's going to be on the screen. It's a bit long of a long passage, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit. And they all say, when did we do that? Jesus says, when you did it to me. When you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. Whenever you served those people, you did it to me. Can you imagine what the Jewish people were thinking when Paul's trying to share his story? Finally, the commander has to take him inside because they don't want to hear it. They've missed their mission, and they don't want anybody poking their finger in their chest saying, hey, think about it. Remember Abraham? Remember Isaac? And Paul's sort of twisting his finger, saying, get back on your mission. The Jewish people were not able to live out God's love for the world because they'd forgotten that the world didn't revolve around them. They were to be part of God's plan to what? Bless the world. And sure, they could tell their rich stories, and I'm sure they had their times around their campfires where they would talk about their heritage and how wonderful God had been to them. But ultimately, they forgot that the story wasn't about them. So instead of worshiping God, their nationality, their culture, protecting themselves had become their idol, and that's who they worshiped. How dare Paul mess with that? They couldn't conceive of what Paul said to the Galatians in 3:28, where he puts it really clearly. From now on, through Jesus, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ. That's good news for all of us. And then to finish up this passage, 22, starting with verse 23. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks, you can almost see this setting. They're shouting, throwing off their cloaks. flinging dust in the air, which was a good tradition for Jewish people in those days when they're angry and they're frustrated, or they're repenting even, throwing the dust up in the air. What a chaotic scene. The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why people were shouting at him like this. He could have just asked him. What would go into your crazy mind to say, hey, let's flog him and interrogate him? He hadn't even asked him yet. Okay, anyway, that's how the Romans did it. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, and this is so funny. Here's Paul. I mean, just put yourself into his place. He's been dragged off by this angry mob. He's been rescued by the commander. He stood on the steps, and now all of a sudden they're going ballistic again. They're yelling and wanting to tear him apart. The commander drags him in and is ready to flog him. And Paul is sort of always in control. At least that's the impression you get, because he just, at the last minute, says, he's stretched out on this stretcher, and they're ready to beat him with a whip, and he says, oh, by the way, is it illegal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty? And you can see the centurion's teeth just dropped out of his mouth. When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. What are you going to do? He asked. This man is a Roman citizen. The commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, I am, he answered. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. I was born a citizen, Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. We're talking about not just interrogating. People were going to beat him to death, nearly. The people who were nearly willing to beat him to death withdrew. That is an understatement. Immediately. Imagine what they'd done. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So Paul just sort of, by the way, what do you do with Roman citizens? Have you ever thought that I might be a Roman citizen? Paul uses, again, here he's using his pedigree to keep opening the doors for the witness of God. Because what does this do? First of all, it embarrasses the commander. I mean, he's terrified. He's almost beat a Roman citizen, which could be really a big deal for him and his role. How troubling. What a close call. Making false assumptions, then acting on them before actually talking to Paul. But notice, Paul uses this screw-up by the commander for kingdom advantage. He waits right until the last minute to say something, but he puts the commander on the defensive to make sure that he doesn't do it again. You can bet the commander is going to ask the next time. And it really opens up, and as you study the next few weeks here, it opens up opportunities for Paul to proclaim the good news of Jesus to all kinds of major leaders who are going to come through. And I won't tell you any more about it because you're all studying that, I presume, but it'll be part of the sermons. But it opens all kinds of opportunities because the commander, if he hadn't realized that, if he hadn't been put on the spot like that, probably would have never opened the doors for Paul to speak to other people who were leaders and kings and all. But with all that we've talked about today, so what? So what? How does it translate into our world, our day-to-day cultural setting? At the beginning, I pointed out some key points I saw, and hopefully you saw some other points that connect to you. And as I've rambled here, some ideas hopefully have come into your mind. So what I want us to do, and I know we're running a little bit late here, I want you to take just a couple minutes and maybe on your bulletin, jot down a couple of thoughts that have come to your mind. Or maybe one of these I gave to you as an idea to get you started. Just what might this passage of Scripture mean in this week as you head into work or whatever you're into tomorrow? Okay, let's just pause. We'll be silent for just a couple minutes, and then I'll pray with us. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this chance to open it up and study it together. And we ask that it wouldn't just remain on the pages as print, but that it would soak into our minds, move into our hearts, and give it warmth and a place to reside and to grow. And then you would use your word to move our feet and our hands as we live to serve you. As Paul described in his story, may we be willing witnesses of how you've made us different. Not to harass people, not to beat them up for what they're not doing right, but just to share your love with them, to serve them, to bless them. Make us a blessing this week to everybody that we touch, and we'll give you praise. Amen.